Anyway, we are a couple minutes late, and so I am going to introduce the first of our 6 speakers. Welcome, everyone. Obviously, we brought the weather. The chairs are almost full, as always, in this amazing event that is so consistently high quality. Very excited for this to start off. We have 6 speakers this morning. We have a break after the first 3. I'm going to start with Dr. Marianne Hatzopoulou, and you can read her faculty profile, and please be assured she is a doctor. There's a little typo in there, but you will see her accomplishments will speak for themselves. Too numerous to list, but I'll say a couple of them. Coincidentally, you may not know this, I had the privilege of being one of the people that reviewed her promotion to professor, which I found about the easiest task I had done in that regard for quite some time, because she's outstanding. She's a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair. For people that don't know, that's essentially the highest academic honor that the government can give in terms of support for a senior researcher. Published many times over, and many of those are very influential, which has led to awards, as you can see. Marianne is going to speak to Beyond Greenhouse Gases, the challenge of achieving fair, health, and community-centered transportation decarbonization, which I think is absolutely perfect for the purpose we're here for today. So, Marianne, please come up. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, here it comes. I was just wondering about that. So it's pretty obvious,
Yeah.
I think. Okay.
Yeah, my main concern was whether this was adjustable. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Marianne Hatzopoulou, a professor at the University of Toronto. I do a lot of research on how to decarbonize transportation and how to do it in a way that can achieve and maximize co-benefits for health, for society. And so I'll be talking a little bit about all of those issues today. The first thing I want to talk about is, let's first acknowledge a little bit our current position in Canada. The first graph that you see on the left shows you the evolution of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in the Canadian context, right, nationwide, for both passenger and freight transportation. So I'm limiting this just to the on-road transportation. From 2000 to 2019, and the first thing you notice is, well, we're definitely not going down. We're trending maybe a little bit upwards, right? Maybe this is insignificant, but we're certainly not going down by any stretch, right? And we've been talking about this for a while, so these trends are not pointing in the right direction. Now, if you look to the graph on the right, this is focused on passenger transportation, right? And you can clearly see the contribution of cars and light trucks being SUVs, right? The increasing contribution of SUVs because we are building more of these vehicles and they are more popular. So they're sort of offsetting a little bit some of the gains in internal combustion engine technology. Now, if we bring it home to Toronto, which is where I do most of my work, right? If we look at Toronto's greenhouse gas emissions, let's acknowledge where we are now when transportation is the part in blue. Now, this graph goes back all the way to the 1990s, right? So this is why you're going to see this big drop between 1990 and 2010. But after that, again, we're not really trending down. There's no significant trend except for 2020, of course. And so where do we want to go for Toronto, right? What is our goal? Where Toronto has a goal of reducing by 30% 2020, 45% by 2025, and a big 65% by 2030. Now let's acknowledge that in 2020 we actually surpassed that goal. We reduced by 43% our emissions. And why? Because of the big drop in transportation emissions. Why? Because of the pandemic. Because everyone was staying at home, and there's clear evidence now that we are certainly going back to post-pandemic traffic, right? And that very, very small trending decrease is probably associated with gains in fuel efficiency, and we are going to unpack that a little bit later. Now remember that if we want to achieve that 65% goal, we need to, that 4.6 megatons in 2020, which is not real, has to go down to 2.5, right? So we're talking about still a long way, and we only have 8 years to achieve that, right? So how do we do this? How do we get there? Before we start exploring that, let's actually think historically about what worked. You know, what has worked over time, right? And we know that for air pollutant emissions, well, standards and regulation have done wonders. We have success stories in terms of reducing air pollutant emissions from internal combustion engines from regulation. Regulation driving the development of new engines, driving the development of new technologies. So we know that has worked. Now, for greenhouse gases, it's only very recently, right, that EPA started to establish greenhouse gas emission standards for vehicles. Now, this is not like air pollution standards where a manufacturer has to meet that standard for every single car. It's sort of a fleet average. So if you're BMW, across all your sales in a specific year, you need to meet a certain greenhouse gas standard. If you don't meet it, like you will see, a lot of manufacturers in the US in recent years haven't met that standard, right? Because you see that the fleet average is higher than the standard. It doesn't mean that you're in non-compliance because you buy credits. It's a very complex system. It's based on an amount of credits that you buy. So you still have a few years to offset these credits, right? The reason why I show you that graph is, again, I mean, maybe the y-axis is a little bit misleading because we're only dropping from 300 to 240, and you see a very strong slope. Again, that's not going to get us to the 65% reduction. And one of the big reasons, again, why we're not able to do that, the chart on the left shows you the rising popularities of SUVs and trucks. And manufacturers can tell you all they want that these vehicles are very fuel efficient, they're turbo engines and GDIs and all sorts of things. But if you see on the right, the yellow line for truck SUV miles per gallon fuel efficiency and the sedan, they're very big. We're talking 9 miles per gallon difference between these. So the higher popularity of these big vehicles, they're really trying to offset a lot of the gains that we're making. Now, just to give you an idea here is just for a specific year, and that was for the year 2021, how that works in terms of your greenhouse gas emission standards, and you can see which manufacturers actually failed to meet that and which ones managed to meet it. And you'll see Tesla with a very negative credit. That really is to tell you that this is sort of set up in a way that once this GHG standard becomes so low that you can't achieve it with internal combustion engines, right, you're bound to start selling more electric vehicles, right, and that's how you would achieve it. Now, it's still not explaining, right, how do we get to that 65%? These are very, very small gains, and sometimes we're offsetting them by building, and buying bigger vehicles. Well, electrification is obviously a big part, and we're going to talk about that. We need to electrify. We can't think about deep decarbonization without electrification. But we also need to think about mode shift and vehicle kilometers reduction, as well as the biggest and most important is land use intensification that will enable all of these things and help them succeed. So we're going to talk about, and I'll sort of go through different stories of electrification, mode shift, as well as land use intensification. Not only do we want to do that, but we want to work in a space whereby these different goals will be able to achieve both climate mitigation, transport equity, and environmental justice, right? If we only subsidize electric vehicles, we're only achieving climate mitigation, but not transport equity and nor environmental justice. And so we really have a very small space where we're going to work and try and prioritize what are our goals and what are policies that will meet those 3 objectives. Now, if I'm going to stop here for a little bit and ask you, if I say, what is your vision of the future of transportation? And I want you to just come up with adjectives. What is the first thing that comes to mind? And you don't have to raise your arm. You can just say it. Fewer cars. That's accessible. What else? Active. What else? Pardon? Community-based. Okay. Anything else? Well, we have a really bold vision, right? If you ask people what they think about the future of transportation, we want it affordable, shared, connected, accessible, electrified. We want all of these things. And the big question, and that's where a lot of my research focuses on, is are all these transportation innovations actually guaranteed to mitigate climate change as well as improve societal goals, right? And which ones will be able to do that? And so the first thing I want to talk about today is talk about electrification, right? What are the benefits of light-duty electric vehicles in a local context, and how do we achieve and maximize those kind of benefits? And that's a study that was led by one of my former PhD students, who is currently a professor at UVic, Laura Minet, who's sitting right there, on trying to tie in travel demand information for individuals in the greater Toronto and Hamilton area, where people live, where they work, where they shop, where they take their kids to school, where they go to daycare, and linking that with information on how much emissions they produce, where these emissions disperse in urban environments. We're using chemical transport models to compute air quality, to generate air quality exposures, as well as look at active transportation and link all of these with ACBAT style benefits, health benefits assessment, to be able to identify what are the anticipated benefits of those reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And so one thing that Laura has done is quantified through air quality improvements the annual benefits of electric vehicles in the greater Toronto and Hamilton area, GTHA, right, from electrifying the entire vehicle fleet. And what she found was basically just looking at mortality only, not other health effects, just looking at mortality, annually we prevent about 300 premature deaths from electrifying our vehicle fleet. There are big spatial gradients in terms of the distributions of these benefits, right? And so these are the benefits that are quantified, and the dollar value is associated with, value of a statistical life. Premature mortality multiplied by a value of statistical life, discounted to current dollars. It's all very back of the envelope, but it gives us a really nice view of what we need to expect. The areas in green are the areas that are going to benefit the most. And for those of you who are familiar with the Greater Toronto Area, this is, Highway 401, the airport, and communities living in these areas are, disproportionately exposed to very high levels of air pollution. Not just the airport in its own right, but the massive amount of trucks, right, that are associated with the airport. We also achieve big reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. We see about 68.5% greenhouse gas emission reductions, right? And what she has done is quantified in monetary value the social benefits of every electric car that would be deployed, discounted to current dollars, and ends up being around $10,000. It's not money in anyone's pocket. It's the social benefit associated with preventing premature mortality. But if you're a regulator, it sort of tells you, right? If I want to subsidize, if I want to incentivize, that's an interesting number to go by. And so, interestingly, when Ontario had a previous Liberal government, the province of Ontario had an EV purchase subsidy or incentive of about $10,000. So it's sort of right on. Now, this is all good. We will achieve greenhouse gas reductions with electrification. We will unlock important co-benefits for air quality, right? But let's just remember that Toronto is one of the most congested cities in the world. The recent INRIX report, INRIX is a company that collects a lot of smartphone data and speed data for roads in cities across the world, and they recently launched their global traffic scorecard, putting Toronto as number 7th most congested city in the world and number 3 in North America, right? So very important to keep that in mind. Millions of electric vehicles on highways, so 401 is not solving any problem of congestion, right? And never mind, we're going to have Rima talk about non-exhaust emissions, right? Those are still going to be there. Just to give you an idea on the evolution of traffic cars, AADT stands for Annual Average Daily Traffic. So it's just an indicator of how many cars are on the road. In Toronto, despite how congested our system is, I still can't believe that number of cars on the road are still on the rise, right? And you see the dip associated with 2020, right? And that's really to kind of acknowledge that changes in behavior, not that I'm saying a pandemic is the solution, will lead to measurable outcomes, right? For those skeptics who say that changes in behavior are not measurable, where they are, we actually see a reduction associated with that. So technology alone is not sufficient. I think it's very important to acknowledge that, right? Especially in terms of, congestion, non-exhaust emissions. We need to start thinking about other kind of policies, other kinds of regulation. So what I'm going to talk about in this second story is the power of behavior and behavioral changes of land use, of density, and the equity in the generation of greenhouse gas emissions. My story is also focused on the Greater Toronto Area. So what we've done in this study is we looked at travel survey information from the whole region, and we started quantifying personal greenhouse gas emissions for every person in the region based on where they live, where they work, and what kind of modes of transportation they're taking. They're walking, they're taking the bus. We accumulated a lot of information on emission intensities, on the ridership of every single bus route, and computed this personal GHG emission inventory associated with transportation for every person who lives in the region. And so after quantifying that, we said, let's map it, okay? Let's go take all these GHG emissions that every person generates per capita, and let's associate them to the area where you live, right? The map on the left is just a description of Greater Toronto Area. You could clearly see the city of Toronto, in the heart of the region, surrounded by the 5 regional municipalities, which are growing immensely. Very high projected population growth for the region. And the map on the right shows you the average mobility greenhouse gas emissions in kilogram per person per day, right? And it's no surprise. The areas that are in light color are the lower ones. People who live in the inner city core, generate very little greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and those who live in the suburbs generate a lot more. There's nothing new, but it's really nice to have numbers that confirm our intuitive hypotheses about the system and how the system works. Then we wanted to see how are these greenhouse gas emissions distributed across the population? So we computed a Gini curve, the Gini index, right? So the blue curve shows you what percentage of the population generates what percent of greenhouse gas emissions. And the orange line is the one-to-one line, right? And what you see here, we see a great disproportion, a great inequity in the distribution. We see that the top 30% of the population, there's 30% of the population that's generated 70% of the total emissions, right? And so not everyone's contributing equally, and we have, those gross emitters who are responsible for the largest portion. Who are these individuals? Well, we know where they live, but who are they? And so we looked at the y-axis in each one of these violin plots is the same thing, is the greenhouse gas emissions in gram per person per day. And on the x-axis, you're going to see different variables, whether it's census variables or neighborhood level variables. So the first thing that you're going to observe is, there is an increasing trend with income. There is an effect of affluence, right? There's a lot of variability, but more affluent individuals generate more greenhouse gas emissions from transportation in a day. There's an increasing trend with car ownership. The more cars you have, the more you use them, and the further you go. So if you buy a car, it doesn't just mean that you're buying it for, that one trip on the weekend. You're buying it, you are going to use it. So greenhouse gas emissions increase, right? The average number of trips that you do in a day increases, but it's not that big, right? Because it has to do with distances to these trips. Now, land use variables, you're going to see here on the x-axis, the first one is accessibility. Somebody said accessibility, and we see the reverse trend. If you live in a neighborhood with high accessibility to employment, to health care, to shopping, to retail, you're going to be generating lower greenhouse gas emissions. Land use entropy has to do with the mixity of land uses in a neighborhood, commercial, residential, together, as opposed to just specific clusters of land use types. And we see also a decreasing relationship. And the big one is population density, right? Higher population density will lead to lower greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, right? And we've already seen that in the map of personal greenhouse gas emissions, where people living in the inner city core are generating a disproportionately smaller amount. So what we've been doing now is we said, okay, if land use and accessibility and mixity and all of these things have such a big effect, let's actually start taking aerial images and neighborhoods, labeling them by the personal greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and let's start training machine learning models to predict. You know, give me an aerial image of your neighborhood and I'll tell you how much greenhouse gas emissions it produces. And it works. I mean, these models actually work. I'm not showing you results because it's really hard to show outcomes of machine learning models, but they actually work. And clearly you could see that the models will pick up on that because there's such a big difference in how those neighborhoods look like. Now, another thing that I really want to point out here is if you look at just the distribution of trips in the region and the distribution of greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to see that 77% of our trips are done by car, 14% by public transit, but the majority, the vast, vast majority of our greenhouse gas emissions are produced by cars. And public transit, even though it supports 14% of the trips, it generates 6% of the greenhouse gas emissions, right? Because of the very, very low emission intensities for public transportation. Now, I want to dwell a little bit on that graph because this was years in the making. It took us a while to accumulate all of this information. These are real-world greenhouse gas emission intensities for actual trips conducted in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area by mode of transportation. Active transport has no line. It's zero greenhouse gases. If you take a subway or a streetcar, light rail, they're electricity powered, and electricity in Ontario, I'm not going to call it clean, but it has a low emission intensity for carbon, right? It's mostly nuclear and hydro, and we have some renewables as well. Subway, streetcar. If you're driving your own electric vehicle, you're sort of there, but a little bit higher actually than light rail, right? If you look at the GO train, and the GO train is our regional rail is entirely diesel fueled. Right? Despite the fact that it's diesel fueled, the median emission intensity is not that high because it's carrying a lot of passenger. All of these numbers are by passenger kilometers traveled, not by vehicle kilometers traveled. And if you're riding the bus, the diesel bus, your emission intensity is about 50 grams per kilometer per passenger. Right? This is at a median level. Of course, you're going to see the biggest variabilities for transit buses because of ridership, right? You know, the good old diesel bus going up and down Kipling Avenue at nighttime empty is generating a lot, right? But at a median level, it is not so far. And if you actually compute, weighted by trips, you compute the emission intensity of all transit, the transit bus, the GO train, the streetcar, and the subway, you end up with an emission intensity of 20 grams per kilometer, and the emission intensity of the electric car, the medians, is 18.6. So we're really not far off. We're not far off. If you look at driving your car, you're going to see very far on the right side, you know, where we're at in terms of driving your own vehicle. It's around 280 grams per kilometer as a median. Toronto is a congested city. The region is quite congested, right? There's a lot of acceleration, deceleration. So the manufacturer ratings, and we've done a lot of tests on that, they don't apply. Whatever fuel efficiencies manufacturers tell you you're going to achieve, you don't achieve them when you drive in Toronto. Now, even though I'm not allowed to put it on the graph because this is still a work in progress, I want to quiz you and then I can tell you if you're right or wrong. What do you think would be the emission intensity for ride-hailing services, Uber and Lyft? Where would you be? On which side? Yes, way there, Mike, absolutely. So it is even further away from driving your car because when you take an Uber, you're not just responsible for the emissions while you are in the ride-hailing services, you're also responsible for the emissions that the driver has generated to come and pick you up. And we're not there in terms of the efficiencies of the system, the optimal efficiencies to really achieve emission intensities that are even comparable to driving. Pooling trips are almost non-existent. It's there, it's an option in the platform, and even drivers who say they're willing to take pool trips, they end up not doing that because there's just not enough demand for this. And so, with transit being such an attractive option, well, imagine what it would look like if we also electrify transit buses. So I go back to Laura's study of looking at the health benefits of just electrifying transit buses, which are diesel, because the electrifying transit buses is not a decarbonization solution, right? I mean, I know transit agencies that keep saying we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. There's just not enough transit buses to achieve deep decarbonization. The health benefits are huge. And this is why I always tell transit agencies, you need to play the health card, the air quality card, because these are diesel buses, right? And so the benefits of electrifying them will be huge for air quality and public health. So we've seen all of this. Let's see what are we actually doing, right? We need to intensify. We need to improve transit. So what is Toronto and the region actually doing? Well, instead of doing that, the first thing we're doing is we're cutting transit service. And I don't know if any one of you follows Toronto news, but the Toronto Transit Commission, TTC, is promising massive transit service cuts because they just can't support anymore their level of service. Number two, well, we're massively failing at delivering large public infrastructure. You know, our Eglinton Crosstown Light Rail Transit project has been in the work for decades and nowhere near finishing, nowhere near ending. And number three, well, we're actually solving the housing crisis by promoting sprawl. And again, if any one of you follows the news, our premier has allowed or wants to allow for building in our green belt. And the green belt is this region that is around the Greater Toronto area. It is sort of this natural way of keeping the density inside, but we're not doing any of those things. Now still, right, passenger transport decarbonization may not be our toughest challenge. And I want to talk a little bit about the rising threat of urban truck movements, right? And what we're seeing in recent years. It's no surprise. It started before the pandemic, but there are huge, massive changes in how Canadians now consume, how they order, how they actually relate to shopping, right? And this rise in e-commerce is putting a lot of pressure, starting on distributors, right? This whole idea of same-day delivery or next-day delivery, or you being able to identify the window where you want your delivery to happen. It just means that the distributor is just going to have to launch a lot of trucks so that they can support that, as opposed to being able to maybe consolidate better their shipments or use alternative modes as well. And so if you look at the emission inventory, and this is our latest for the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, right? Cars and SUVs are generating, 76% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But it's the diesel trucks that are responsible for majority of the air pollutants, right? Especially in the Greater Toronto area, you have about 70% of black carbon emissions that are generated by diesel trucks, and then 52% of NOx, and it goes the same for all the other pollutants. Most of the air pollution we have is driven by trucks. Our fleet of trucks is really old, right? It's not that there's a lot of them. There is a lot of them, and they're very, very old, and I'll tell you how old they are in a minute. So the other biggest threat is that the vehicle kilometers traveled from trucks are actually on the rise. So if you look at the two graphs on the right side, the truck VKT and the passenger VKT, the vehicle kilometers traveled, you actually see this very steady rise in truck vehicle kilometers. And that started before COVID and continued on during COVID, even though you see a decline in passenger cars, right? So people stopped moving, trucks continued to increase during the pandemic. So what we did in the scenario to look at the air quality benefits of trucks, we said we're not going to look at electrification. Long-haul electrification is still not an option. We want to be realistic. Let's actually look at the effect of all of our trucks converting to new diesel, meaning 2008 standards and newer, right? And we know that EPA has radically changed 2007, 2008, their emission standards on diesel. And we see huge benefits. We see massive benefits. There's a lot of value in that. And I think this is something that we need to be talking about as opposed to saying, no, we don't want liquid fuels at all. We actually see the biggest benefits for public health in terms of premature mortality compared to the other scenarios, with 407 premature deaths prevented per year. Oh, that's the burden of trucks. And that's the benefit of trucks, right? 275 premature deaths per year. And we quantified the social benefits, again, just from multiplying that with the value of statistical life, of about $300,000 per cleaner truck over the lifetime of the truck. That's more or less the cost of a new truck, right? If you're buying a new diesel truck, probably a little bit less than that. I mean, maybe an electric truck will go a little bit more. But there is very important value in this. And you can clearly see in green where you see the big, big benefits. And these are, again, in Peel region, around the airport, around these distribution centers. We looked at the environmental justice implications of greening those truck movements, right? And so what you see in those graphs, I want you to focus on the last one first on the right, and then we go back to the other ones, is just the benefits for NO2 reduction from switching our trucks to diesel. The green bar shows you the benefits for the first quintile, right? And the red bar shows you the benefits, the green bar for the fifth quintile of socioeconomic status, and the red bar for the first quintile, right? So the most socially disadvantaged is always in the green, right? And so you can clearly see that in this policy, not only are we improving air quality for everyone, but we are improving air quality in the areas with the highest social disadvantage, whether you use variables, medium income, recent immigrant, ethnicity, etc., it fares across all of these different variables of socioeconomic status, right, compared to the improvements in the fifth quintile. And we see this for, electrifying cars and electrifying buses, but it really is pronounced, very pronounced for trucks, right? There's a very important here story for switching our trucks to new diesel and achieving benefits for those who need it the most. If your province, your city, was ever considering off-peak delivery, just small parentheses, a sidebar, don't do it. The province of Ontario was toying with this idea of allowing for off-peak delivery. Off-peak delivery means that you have truck deliveries that are occurring in the evening and at nighttime. And this is very retailer specific, right? Not all retailers. If you're delivering produce, well, somebody has to be there to receive that shipment, right? And so you're not going to do it at nighttime because the restaurant is not going to have a staff member there to receive that shipment. But there's a lot of other kind of deliveries that can occur in the evening. So we worked with the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, which is an NGO in the region, to quantify what is the impact. Like, do we actually reduce emissions or do we actually increase emissions? What we actually found is that by switching more trucks to the evening, the first thing you do is you make more space on the road during daytime, so you will have more drivers. Right? This is the impact of induced demand. This is something we often forget, right? Every time you make space on the road and you reduce the travel time and you improve traffic speeds, you are going to have the effect of some people giving up a public transit trip to actually hop in their car now because it's faster, right? So the vehicle kilometers traveled are going to increase. We also saw some increases in greenhouse gas emissions, but most importantly, what we saw is that what you're doing is by dumping air pollutant emissions at nighttime, the overall effect on air quality is bad. So you basically improve air quality during the day, but worsen it by so much at nighttime. So what I want you to focus on, the only thing I really want you to focus on, is the bar chart with the middle part where the trucks were shifted from the middle part to the one on the right. And the increases that happen at nighttime in concentrations for black carbon and NO2 are much bigger than the decreases that you see in the middle of the day. So the daily average concentration is higher. Because of that, because you're generating emissions in a nighttime atmosphere, which is known to be, quite stable. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and it's a very, very piece before I wrap things up, is on automation and connectivity. And I don't like to talk a lot about vehicle automation because I don't think the technology is there, and I don't think it's going to shape our cities as much as we think that it's going to. But here you go. We did a simulation study and said, well, what happens if we start having those fully automated vehicles, right? And the first thing we said is, let's just assume that we have households that only own cars, that don't use transit at all. And suddenly now they have an automated vehicle. So the vehicle on its own can drive dad to work and then come back and drive mom to work as well and then come back and drive the kids to school and do all of these things. What is the effect of having an automated vehicle? So what we actually found is that, well, people will give up vehicles. So we see a big reduction in car ownership, but the daily greenhouse gas emission will increase by 51%. Why? Because Mike, you just said it, because of this additional kilometers of going back and forth as opposed to being parked somewhere to be able to serve all of these individuals. In scenario 2, we said, let's actually now give an automated vehicle to households that also use public transit, right? And see what happens if they have an automated vehicle. Well, suddenly now you don't even have to take the TTC, the car will take you. Because daddy doesn't have the car parked at work all day, the car can come back and take you. And actually we see now a doubling of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Some of it because of relocation and some of it because of a transit trip now that was replaced by a car trip. Right? So all this to say, and this is sort of, I like to tell this piece more in the context of ride-hailing services, right? The Uber and the Lyft effect is that, you know, because of these empty kilometers, we call them, or the zombie miles, right? Where the car is empty, the driver is just roaming around empty, the net emission intensity is really high. So I think with this, you all agree with me that the solution to transport decarbonization is quite multifaceted, right? We want electrification, but not just electrification. We want affordable electrification as well. We want to think about freight, and we need freight decarbonization, which is as important as passenger mobility decarbonization. We also need, we can't just move large Canadian metropolitan regions on electric vehicles and bikes. We need multimodal hubs. We need transit-oriented development. We need to be able to build large public infrastructure and not get stuck. We need to deliver on these. We want to reclaim road space for sure. And we want to make sure that our solutions, at least the ones we're developing here, are not just sensitive to the Canadian context, but also relevant to global context, because we have a responsibility to think about these solutions as well. And we want to do this all in the context of preserving equity, diversity, and inclusion. So you probably all agree that the solution is highly complex, right? The individual solutions are there, but we need to be able to also sit down, rank them, prioritize them, figure out how do we spend our dollars across all of these different objectives. And the last thing I want to leave you with is this new book by Ben Flyberg and Dan Gardner on, it's called How Big Things Get Done. And it really talks about, you know, the inability of people to actually get big projects done. It explains why a lot of large infrastructure, public infrastructure fails in the North American context. They coined a very interesting term, think slow, act fast. And I think this really says a lot about the problem we're faced with. We are in a state of climate urgency, and that is making us feel that we need to act fast. Climate urgency, we need something, we need a solution. But the problem is that if we just think very, very fast, those solutions are not going to be sustainable enough that they will promote all of the other co-benefits. The only thing we're going to think about is just to roll out electrification, right, and leave everything else behind. We need to be able to sit down and think about how do we develop our urban areas, how do we redevelop, how do we densify, how do we solve our housing crisis. In big regions like Toronto, they're expected, we're going to be 10 million tomorrow. And where do you house all of these people? And how do you do this while maintaining your climate goals? And so we need to be able to invest in that possibility. And I think with this, I'll end my talk and take questions. Thank you.
People understand what I meant about that. By the way, it's good for you, right, to stand up. But it's also good for these guys because, then they put on their CV, standing O and all this stuff, right? Okay, I'm really super appreciative that you left this time. That's so important. Thank you for coming. I know we're trying to decrease carbon by flying, but I think you'll agree, like having you here, I'm still trying to figure it out, but it's really powerful. Allow me to ask one thing, and I'm kind of looking to Kate over there, just because Kate is a health economist, and I'm really interested in this construct that you used with your colleagues in terms of the dollars and cents and the social benefit idea. I'm novice at this, but Kate's an expert, and the traditional thing I'm sure you know is dollars per quality or quality adjusted life year, and you have a different construct. At least to me, it's kind of new with the social benefit. How is that playing out in policy circles, which it's great you're so involved with? It's so cool that you're into the impact in the real world. But do they respond to that? Because there's kind of a traditional way, and it's somewhat rigid oftentimes, this quality framework. And I'll just give you back the mic. And I thought there might be a circulating mic for, thank you. Okay, go ahead. Did that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. No, this is not a net present value analysis, by no means. And so this is just really a number to contextualize this. How do policymakers respond to this? No, they don't. They haven't responded to this. I don't think this has had an impact. I think, but it also could be that we haven't reached the right audiences. I talk about this and I always get a lot of nods, but that doesn't really get us further. But I think this is at least to basically say when you do these kind of analysis, you have to include those impacts and you have to quantify them and you have to put a dollar value to them. TransLink, when they're developing their business case, they have to do this. Look at air quality improvements and contextualize it and include it in a robust net present value quantification. That's really the message. Yeah.
Okay, so Mandy's got the mic.
We have an online question. Question is from Greg Baytalon, and it's about vehicle emissions. Question is, how much impact is related to the increasing practice of door-to-door delivery from online purchases like Amazon, DoorDash, etc., versus the old-fashioned shopping?
Yeah, it is increasing. It is absolutely, there's no doubt about it anymore. E-commerce at this stage, the way it is practiced and the way people are shopping and the way people are getting their stuff delivered is increasing greenhouse gas emissions from shopping as opposed to driving yourself, doing your shopping trip and actually driving home. Yes.
Thanks, man. Connor Reynolds with Metro Vancouver, and I think there's quite a few policy developers in the room, so maybe not policy deciders necessarily. My question is, when it comes to, one of the things you didn't mention, which is quite prevalent here in the Metro region, is car sharing. So Modo, and there's other models as well. And I've seen some interesting work that suggests that can reduce GHGs. And my question related to that is, if you think demographics as, younger people who may be less inclined to buy licenses or get licenses and buy vehicles, do you think that could have an impact?
Yeah. So car sharing will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that is because of the effect of car ownership. Right? When you own a car, you are going to use it a lot more often. If you still have to use the app, reserve your car, go take it for an essential trip, you really are using car share for essential trips, right? Because this is an out-of-pocket expense, and the way you perceive that expense in your decision making is very, very different than the way you do once you've bought your car and you filled your tank. You don't think anymore, about the cost of every trip that you are taking. That's a good thing. The question of millennials, turning to the sharing economy, it's all good. There are some studies that are cautioning us that this is just a phase of life, and when they hit their 30s and 40s, they will still want the suburban home and they will still want to own their vehicle. I still don't know. It might be too soon to assert whether these trends are here to stay, but I'm just putting it out there. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about equity, especially with electrification. So I was just reading something today about even non-electric vehicles, the price, is just skyrocketing and becoming unaffordable. And so I guess there's a challenge. So electrification is probably going to decrease inequity, as well as sort of make probably transit less attractive to higher income individuals. So what are your thoughts about, what governments can actually do to move towards electrification but not make it less equitable than it is now even?
Yeah, that is a big problem. It is a big problem because, electrification is only affordable to a very select few and will stay affordable to a very select few. People who are mobility poor, they can't own anyway a newer combustion engine to start with. So there is a very big downfall that with electric vehicles will induce vehicle kilometers travel because it's so cheap to charge your vehicle. So you'll drive, and you'll drive with it quite a bit. The onus is really on continuing to build transit. We absolutely have to do that. And this whole model of just using transit revenues to be able to invest in transit just does not work, right? Transit is a social service. I was at a workshop this week. We were talking about this transit agencies viewing themselves as, are we just transit operators now, or are we basically fixing the social problems? Is it our job to fix poverty by providing transit service in areas with maybe not very high ridership as a social service? And I say, yeah, it is. Or the alternative for them is why don't you fix poverty on its own, right? So I think we're still trying to deflect the problem, but we have to continue investing in transit system and investing in active transport infrastructure, and we need to densify and rethink the way we use the land in our cities.
I wasn't going to kind of get it. Yeah, okay, we have time, just because it falls on that. Wasn't going to get into it because it's kind of a naive hand-waving thing, but still it struck me about how Toronto is defunding, as you said. And I just figured, it's politics and blah, blah, blah. But I do want to ask, based on your experience, I always, am generally proud coming from the U.S. of Canada as progressive, and that seems very regressive. And is there anything more to it that we can learn? I'm not just wanting to complain, but is there something to actually be learned about why that is happening in this day and age? And is there a social movement that's not, again, hand-waving that could come to bear on that kind of unacceptable practice? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I'm just going to hand wave. I have a colleague who was recently giving a talk on housing and talking about, had the terms public affluence, personal sufficiency, right? And how we really are now on the very opposite of the spectrum, at least in the Toronto area. I don't know. I mean, every time I go in the States and I see the billions of dollars that are being invested in infrastructure for vehicle electrification, it's massive, it's insane, and I think that the US is going to electrify way faster than we do. And I keep saying to myself, I hope that the forces down south don't affect still how we think in the Canadian context, because this is not where we want to be. But at the same time, yeah, absolutely, I mean, we're not seeing our governments making any strides to improve transit systems. I have no answer. Yeah. Yeah.
It's just an observation. I live in a rural, northern, resource-based city. The model is not easily transferable. I personally looked at electric vehicles. I'm a traveling salesman. I'm off the scale on, and it wasn't practical. So how do we bring these kind of ideas to a lot of Canada? Lots live in the city, but there's a lot of people that don't live in the city as well.
Yeah, you got me there. That's one thing we always do. We're so Toronto-centric when we're in Toronto. I totally agree. I don't work in that space, but I do have colleagues who focus their entire work on small and medium-sized cities, on rural areas, because those solutions don't apply at all. They don't translate at all to a metropolitan regional context. This being said, if you look at the carbon footprint of where you live and you compare it with what is coming out of these big metropolitan areas, for decarbonization, we have to prioritize the metropolitan areas because they're generating a lot, they're driving a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions. But for other co-benefits, I agree with you. Yeah.
We have a couple minutes. This is a really detailed thing. It'll only take a second, but I was curious about the nighttime data, and I would have thought less start and stop. So I was expecting some benefit. Maybe you were too. And I think you said in passing it's about stagnant air. Is that the idea? Okay. So I guess that's that. We're good here. Okay. Well, we'll be around to chat, and thank you so much.